They draped her in gold, but it felt like chains. Eleanor Tudor sat silent as the seamstress fastened the final pearl at her throat, her reflection a stranger in the polished mirror. "The Lord of Thornwick awaits," the attendant whispered, as if that should inspire awe rather than dread. He was older than her father, with lips that smacked when he spoke and eyes that lingered too long. The marriage had been announced with triumph, an alliance between two noble houses sealed in blood and obedience. But no one had asked Eleanor. She was a daughter of the royal line, but that hadn't saved her. It had only made her valuable. Her mother had died in childbirth. Her brother, the young king, was too weak to defy the council, so she had become a coin to be spent. As the castle bells tolled, she stepped through the archway, the stone floor cold beneath her velvet slippers. Courtiers bowed, not to honor her, but the bargain she represented. She did not cry. A princess did not cry, but her hands trembled beneath the folds of her gown. At the end of the hall stood the Lord of Thornwick, his smile too wide, his fingers adorned with rings that glittered like false promises, and beside him, slightly behind, was the only face that looked at her with something other than possession, Thomas, her personal guard. He had been with her since her 12th year, always silent, always steady. He nodded once. She blinked, the smallest movement, but in that moment she knew. He had not forgotten. He had not given up. That night, as the feast roared and men drank to her future, she slipped from the hall under pretense of illness. Her chambers were cold, empty, until he appeared from the servants' door. "You have one chance," Thomas whispered, his voice low and urgent. "Do you trust me?" She looked into his eyes, familiar, defiant, loyal. "I always have." And so she removed the crown, the earrings, the veil. Not a princess now, just a girl choosing escape over obedience, a girl choosing freedom no matter the cost. And with one breathless step into the dark corridor, Eleanor began her escape. They moved like shadows, through corridors once lit with splendor, now cloaked in silence. Thomas led, his sword sheathed but ready, his steps rehearsed from years of quiet watching. Eleanor followed close, her slippers traded for soft boots, her gown cut at the knees, bundled beneath a plain cloak. She had never moved so freely, not as a princess, not as a prisoner. The cold air in the servants' tunnels bit at her cheeks, but she didn't flinch. Every step was a vow. Behind them the castle pulsed with celebration, blind to her absence. It was not the wine that dulled the court's eyes. It was tradition. No one would expect a Tudor daughter to run. No one would dare imagine a royal bride vanishing into the bones of the fortress. They passed the laundry chambers, the armory, the cellar stair. At the base of the west tower, Thomas pressed his hand to the wall. A narrow panel clicked. "I found this when I was 16, he whispered. "Smugglers once used it. Now we do." The hidden door groaned open, revealing a damp passage that led beneath the curtain wall. The stone dripped with moss, the air thick with earth and iron. Eleanor stepped in without hesitation. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "You'll be hunted, stripped of your station, killed." "I was never more than your shadow," Thomas replied, leading the way. "Now I choose what I become." She couldn't see his face in the dark, but she didn't need to. His loyalty had never been in his words. It was in the way he stood between her and danger, in the way he never asked for thanks. They emerged beneath the outer stables, where 2 horses waited, tethered near the tree line. "Where will we go?" she asked as he hoisted her into the saddle. "Somewhere your name doesn't matter," he said. "Where you're not sold by blood." She tightened her grip on the reins. "Then let Eleanor Tudor die tonight. And who shall rise in her place?" She looked toward the moon, its light silver on her skin. Someone who can run. Someone who can choose. And as they vanished into the trees, the great castle behind them echoed only with music and lies, unaware that its most priceless prisoner had chosen the open road over a gilded cage. By morning, the proclamation had been read aloud in every village square from Kent to York. Eleanor Tudor, heir of Lancaster and sister to the king, is missing. The parchment bore the royal seal, the reward inked in bold gold. £1,000 for her return. Unharmed, if possible. The word traitor had not been spoken, but it lingered in every mouth that whispered her name. Eleanor rode hard through the early frost, her breath visible in the cold air, her hands blistered from holding the reins. Thomas didn't speak unless necessary. He guided her through hunting paths, across shallow streams, and beneath low-hanging branches that tore at her cloak. They slept little, ate less. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't dreaming of escape. She was living it. On the fourth night, they stopped in a hollow where an abandoned mill slouched against a stream. Thomas dismounted first, checking the shadows before helping her down. Her legs trembled as they touched the ground. "You need rest," he said quietly. She nodded. "And you?" He shrugged. "I never had much use for sleep. Too many ghosts." They sat near the millstone, the stars overhead sharp and cold. Eleanor leaned her head against the wooden post, exhausted but alive. "Do you think they'll find us?" "Yes," Thomas said, eventually. "Then why keep going?" "Because running is better than kneeling." She looked at him. "Even if we die?" He met her gaze, his voice low. "I'd rather die free beside you than live in silence behind you." She turned away quickly, heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "I was supposed to be a queen," she murmured, "not a fugitive." "They would have made you a crown of rust and rules," he said. "You were never meant for their throne." She didn't answer, but that night, beneath broken rafters and beside a man who had chosen her freedom over his future, Eleanor slept deeper than she had in her father's palace. In the morning, a boy arrived, barefoot, breathless, clutching a letter. "They're searching the western woods," he whispered. "They've sent men with dogs." Thomas stood immediately. Eleanor rose too, her hand already on the saddle strap. The crown might chase her, but it would never hold her again. Not while she still had breath. Not while Thomas still stood. The fires at Thornwick burned for 2 days, not because the old lord had died, but because the pride of the court demanded spectacle. Eleanor and Thomas saw the smoke from a ridge 30 miles away, black clouds stretching toward heaven like a funeral dirge no one dared name. "They think you did it," Thomas said, watching the plume with narrowed eyes. "They want the world to see what disobedience looks like." Eleanor didn't flinch. "Did he suffer?" "No," he replied. "A fever. Nothing glorious, nothing tragic, but they won't say that." She nodded. "Then let them have their legend. I'd rather be a ghost than their bride." The road had grown harder. Inns turned them away once coin ran out. Some recognized her face from the royal sketches, though her cloak was threadbare and her hair now chopped to her shoulders. She no longer looked like a princess. She looked like a woman fleeing a country that once called her its jewel. They traveled north, toward the borderlands, where the reach of the crown thinned and names meant less. But with every village they passed, the whispers followed. The runaway royal, the guard who betrayed his oath, the girl who refused her wedding bed. In a small hamlet tucked beneath the cliffs, a washerwoman gave them bread. "I don't believe what they say," she whispered as she placed the crust in Eleanor's hand. "I heard you ran from a man who bought you like a goat." "He bought my title," Eleanor said, eyes steady, "not my soul." The woman smiled. "Then you're the only noble I've ever liked. That night, Eleanor sat with her back to a tree, listening to the forest breathe. Thomas sat across from her, polishing the hilt of his sword. "You could leave," she said suddenly, "disappear without me, start over without this weight on your name." "I didn't choose the weight," he replied. "I chose the person carrying it." "You were sworn to protect me as a royal." "I protect you now, because you're not." She stared at him across the fire. "You're either the bravest man I've ever known, or the most foolish." He met her gaze without blinking. "In love, there's no difference." She didn't answer, but her heart did, loud enough to drown the fire, loud enough to feel like hope. They reached the pine woods of Northumbria by dusk, following deer paths and old Roman trails no longer marked on royal maps. The silence there was thicker, as if the forest held its breath for fugitives. Eleanor kept close behind Thomas, her blade strapped to her hip. His training had been ruthless but necessary. She no longer feared the weight of steel. She feared only what might come through the trees. That night, they camped beneath a slanted boulder near a frozen stream. Thomas left briefly to check the ridge. When he returned, his jaw was tight. "Riders, south of us, 8, maybe 9, moving fast." "Soldiers?" "Too quiet for that," he said. "Bounty men." Eleanor's stomach sank. The royal court had grown impatient. Now the dogs weren't trained, they were paid. "We can't outrun them forever," she said. "Then we won't," he replied. "We'll disappear." "Isn't that what we've been doing?" "No," he said, kneeling to draw a rough map in the dirt. "We've been running. Now we vanish." The plan was simple, brutal, and dangerous. Before sunrise, they would ride north to the Black Glen, an ancient cut in the land where the mist never lifted and only smugglers dared pass. Once through it, they could reach the old ruins near Bryn, a broken monastery untouched by war or politics. "They'll expect us to head west," Thomas said, "toward ships, toward escape, not deeper in." Eleanor stared at the line he drew, her heart thudding. "What if they catch us before we reach it? Then I hold them off. And if they kill you?" He met her eyes. "Then run and never look back." She grabbed his wrist. "Don't say that again." He didn't promise he wouldn't, but he placed his hand over hers. A soldier's touch turned soft by something stronger than duty. At dawn, they rode. The forest swallowed them whole. Behind them, hoofbeats echoed faintly. Closer now, Eleanor didn't look back. She didn't cry. She just held the reins, her hood pulled low, the wind burning her cheeks as tears never would. They reached the edge of the Black Glen by nightfall. It was colder there, quieter, a graveyard of trees, and just before they crossed into shadow, she whispered, "If we don't make it, know this." Thomas turned. She kissed him once. Brief, final. "You were never my guard," she said. "You were my escape." And they vanished into the fog. The Black Glen swallowed all sound. Even the horses grew quiet, their hooves muffled by moss and mud. The trees here stood like sentinels, twisted by time, their branches draped with fog that clung to Eleanor's cloak like fingers. Thomas said nothing as they rode, his hand never far from the hilt of his blade. He knew, just as she did, that men were close. The bounty hunters had followed, slower now, cautious but determined. The path narrowed to a crumbling stone arch, half consumed by ivy. Beyond it, the ruins of Bryn emerged like a forgotten dream, walls broken, altar stones covered in lichen, a shattered bell lying silent in the grass. "We'll stay here tonight," Thomas said. "They won't enter holy ground until dawn." "And after? We won't be here." He led her through the nave, where shattered stained glass painted the floor in dull colour. They found a dry chamber where monks had once prayed. It smelled of damp earth and something older, something sacred. As Thomas began to prepare a barricade near the entrance, Eleanor traced the carvings on the wall. Angels, wings cracked, a kneeling queen with no face. "Do you believe in saints?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I believe in choices." "And what have I chosen?" "To live," he turned, eyes dark. "To run, to fight, to love. You've chosen everything they tried to take." She stepped toward him, her voice barely a breath. "And you?" "I chose you." The words fell like a vow, and in that quiet, broken space, they became more than fugitives, more than guard and royal. They became what only truth can make, equal. That night, she lay beside him on stone, his arm beneath her head, the warmth of his body her only shield against the cold. She didn't sleep, not fully, but she rested. For the first time in years, she was not waiting to be summoned or sold. At dawn, she awoke to the sound of crows and the glint of steel through the trees. The bounty men had arrived, but Thomas was already on his feet, blade drawn, breath calm. She stood beside him, no longer hiding, no longer afraid. "You're worth dying for," he said. She shook her head. "Then stay alive. I'm not done choosing you." And together they stepped into the ruins to make their final stand. They came at first light, cloaks dark, swords drawn, riding hard through the fog as if vengeance rode with them. The bounty leader, a former knight stripped of honor but not skill, shouted orders as he dismounted, his boots crunching the frost. "Bring her back breathing," he growled. "The guard is expendable." Eleanor stood in the center of the ruined nave, the broken arch behind her glowing faint with morning light. She held no weapon, only her presence, her eyes burning with resolve. "I won't go," she said. "I am not his to return, and I was never yours to take." The knight stepped forward, but Thomas was already there, steel drawn, body squared between her and every threat. He moved like a man who had waited years for this moment, not to kill, but to protect something real. The first blade came down. Thomas caught it mid-swing, turned it, dropped the man in a single motion. Another lunged, another fell. But they were too many. A cut bloomed across his shoulder, then another near his ribs. Eleanor didn't scream, she moved. With a stone from the altar, she struck one attacker from behind. She grabbed a fallen blade. Her hands trembled, but she raised it. She wasn't trained, but she wasn't helpless. "She fights," one of the men spat, backing away. "Like a Tudor," another muttered. "Like a queen." Thomas, bloodied and breathless, stood with her back to back, blades lifted. "You still think we're worth the price?" He growled. The knight hesitated. The men looked to each other. They had expected a girl, weak and whimpering. Not this. Not two people who stood like saints guarding the last chapel on earth. "We won't chase ghosts," the knight said at last. "Let the crown find its own traitors." They withdrew, slowly, bitterly, but they left. When the last hoofbeats faded, Eleanor dropped the blade and sank to her knees beside Thomas. He was pale, breathing shallow. "You're not dying," she said through gritted teeth. "That's an order." He smiled faintly. "So bossy for a runaway." She kissed his brow, pressed her hand to his wound. "You didn't die for me. You lived. That's the only story I'll ever tell." And as the sun rose higher, Caer Bryn held not defeat, but something greater, survival carved into stone and sealed by love that bowed to no crown. The wound festered by nightfall, and Eleanor worked by firelight, grinding wild herbs between stones, mixing moss and stream water into a poultice the old washerwoman had taught her how to make. Thomas lay silent, jaw clenched, his breath shallow but steady. He didn't complain. He never did. That was what terrified her most. "You should sleep," he whispered, voice rough as gravel. "And miss the chance to save you," she snapped. "Not likely." She pressed the poultice to his ribs. He winced, but didn't pull away. "You've grown fierce." "I was always fierce," she murmured. "You just weren't allowed to see it." He gave a weak smile. "I saw it. Every time you didn't flinch when they spoke of your wedding. Every time you walked down that corridor like you wore the crown, not your brother." She paused, hands trembling. "You never called me by name, not once, not since we left. Because it wasn't safe. Say it now." He looked at her. "Eleanor." She inhaled like it was the first breath she'd taken in days. "And what name do I call you, Thomas? You who burned your oath and walked into exile for me." He closed his eyes. No name, no title, just the man who stayed. The wind moaned through the ruined walls like a hymn. Outside, the forest had quieted. The crown had stopped chasing, for now. But inside the monastery, the past still pressed against the walls like memory. She leaned over him, hand resting on his chest, feeling the rhythm of his heart. "I could leave you here," she said softly. "Disappear into the north. Let them think we both died in the fire." "Would you?" "Never." She kissed his lips. Soft. Sure, not the way a princess kisses a guard, but the way a woman claims a truth too long buried. "When you wake," she whispered, "we'll choose names that are ours alone. No titles. No chains." And then she wrapped him in every spare cloth they owned, her back against the door, sword across her knees. She would guard him now, as fiercely as he had guarded her. Let the crown keep its scrolls, let history forget them. Love, real love, needed no witnesses. Only two hearts, still beating, in a place where names were no longer spoken, and never needed to be. Spring came slowly to the ruins of Caer Bryn. Snow melted in strips, revealing moss-covered stones and wildflowers pushing up through cracks in the earth. Thomas healed one day at a time, first sitting, then walking, then lifting the sword again, not for war, but to remember who he was. Eleanor never left his side. She built traps for rabbits, gathered roots, repaired the thatch roof with hands that once held a scepter. They spoke little of the past. It belonged to another version of them, her with a crown, him with a uniform. But the road ahead, that was still unwritten. One morning he stood beside her at the edge of the glen, watching mist rise from the valley. "You still want to run?" he asked. "No," she said. "I want to walk, with you. And if they find us again? Then we'll vanish again. We're good at that." He smiled. "Where?" "Somewhere no map dares name. Where my blood doesn't make me a prize." "And me?" "You," she said, turning to him, "are no longer my guard." He raised an eyebrow. "What am I then?" She stepped closer. "You are the road I chose when the world offered me none." That day they packed lightly, a single pack between them. Her hair was long again now, braided back with twine. His cloak still bore the royal crest, faded now into nothing. They left Caer Bryn without a word, without a prayer. They owed nothing to the stones or saints. They crossed rivers, climbed ridges, and passed through villages where no one recognized her face. Sometimes they gave false names. Sometimes they gave none at all. They stayed where they were welcome, moved on when they weren't. And slowly, in the quiet spaces between danger and distance, they built something no title could define. A home, a life, a peace earned, not out-inherited. In a green valley far beyond the reach of any banner, they built a cottage with their hands, and on its door they carved no name. Only a mark, two circles interlinked. Not a symbol of royalty, not a crest, a promise. "If I die before you," Thomas once said, "what will you tell them I was?" She smiled, pressing her forehead to his. The man who gave a princess back her life, and never asked for it in return. Years passed, and no one came. No riders, no parchments nailed to doors, no guards bearing the crown's wrath. The world had moved on, as it always does. Kings died, borders shifted. The old stories faded into myths whispered over fire. But in a quiet valley far from palaces and prisons, the story lived on in silence. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the cottage she and Thomas had built, her hands dusted with flour, a pot simmering behind her. The wind danced through the heather, carrying the faint scent of lavender and smoke. Behind her, laughter echoed. Thomas with a child on his shoulders, his hair streaked with grey, his eyes still steady as the first day she saw him on the castle steps. Their daughter's name was Lynn, born in a thunderstorm, her cry louder than lightning. She did not know what it meant to kneel for titles, only what it meant to grow wild and brave. "She climbs like you," Eleanor said as Thomas carried the child inside, both covered in mud and moss. "And talks like you," he replied, kissing her cheek. "Bold, bossy. That's the Tudor in her," he grinned. "I prefer the part that's just her." That evening, as they sat outside watching the sky bleed into stars, Lynn fell asleep in Eleanor's lap, a book open across her chest. "Do you miss it?" Thomas asked. "The castle, the crown." She thought for a moment. "I miss the feeling of being powerful, but not the way they gave it. I found more strength when I carried firewood than I ever did in gold. You were never meant to be theirs." "No," she whispered, "I was meant to choose, and I chose you." He leaned his head against hers. "We're just a story now, aren't we?" To them, yes. A rumor, a runaway bride, a traitor guard. And to you, she smiled. You're the beginning of everything. Years later, when Lynn asked where they came from, Eleanor would not speak of palaces or ceremonies. She would walk her child to the edge of the valley, point to the wind moving through the trees and say, "Here, this is where I was reborn, not as a princess, as a woman who chose her own ending." And when the wind blew harder, it seemed to agree, carrying not memory, but truth, the kind only the wild remembers.